Hello, everybody. I am Dr. An Jae-oh. I live in South Korea. I earned my PhD from the University of Wuppertal in Germany, where my advisor was Professor Dr. Manfred Baum. In this YouTube video, I applied the structure of Heidegger's concept of ready-to-hand from his being and time, as well as the emergence of presence at hand through the damage and the loss of tools, to Shakespeare's tragedy King Lear, to explore the process of dramatizing the existential truth of life, that is, awareness through loss. And I will use AI voice. Thank you very much.
7. Heidegger and Shakespeare, recognition through loss. Being and time is, simply put, a phenomenological ontology. However, its fundamental strategy and methodology are most exemplarily articulated in the section on readiness to hand. In particular, it is here that we encounter the transition from readiness to hand to presence at hand, and from there to the concept of the world. Heidegger's concept of the world is a landmark achievement in the history of philosophy. Furthermore, the factors that trigger the shift from readiness to hand to presence at hand are damage, unusability, and unsuitability. In other words, presence at hand emerges when the tools or equipment being used are broken, damaged, unusable, or unsuitable. This lecture applies themes such as damage, unsuitability, unusability, and conspicuousness, as found in Heidegger's work Being and Time, as applied to an interpretation of Shakespeare's tragedy King Lear. Part 1 primarily interprets the section on readiness to hand from being and time, while Part 2 interprets King Lear through the lens of Heidegger's philosophy, that is, loss and emptiness remind us of reality. Homo faber and being at hand, das Zuhandene in German. Heidegger's philosophy begins with the most fundamental and everyday phenomena of human life, work, and labor. This forms the core of Heidegger's philosophy. Among these activities, Heidegger identifies the fundamental phenomena of the world and humanity in work performed with tools. He does not ask what the meaning of work is, but rather analyzes the phenomenon of tool use. For example, he does not ask about the meaning of work, such as whether humans survive through work or realize their dreams. Being and Time describes the essential structure of tool use as it appears. It analyzes tool-based work from the perspective of a kind of descriptive psychology. Being and Time is a descriptive psychology of tool-using work. While Being and Time certainly addresses profound themes such as existence, death, anxiety, the world of people, and the sense of time, its description of tool-using work constitutes a single original phenomenon. And it is through this process that the essential structure of Heidegger's theory of truth, namely unconcealment or aletheia, unfolds. It is unclear why, among all human activities, tool use was chosen as the starting point for fundamental ontology. But this may reflect the German cultural tradition that holds craftsmanship in high regard. Heidegger's concept of the tool pursues a meaning entirely distinct from that of the tool in philosophical anthropology, which views humans as Homo faber, the tool-making animal. To state the conclusion first, Heidegger constructs the world through tool use. In other words, humans do not merely make or use tools within the world, that is, the given environment, but rather construct the entity known as the world through the phenomenon of tooling.
The world flows forth from the tool.
See instrumental being. Before proceeding to the phenomenological analysis of tool use, I will briefly describe the so-called scientific world criticized by Husserl and Heidegger. The modern world is constituted as an objective system. The objective world is constituted by mathematics and the laws of nature. However, the world revealed by Heidegger's human being, that is, Dasein, is not composed of objects, but of instrumental entities already in use within the surrounding world. These entities are not mere things, but are always given as tools related to specific tasks. Thus, their mode of being is readiness to hand, Zuhandenheit in German. The essence of Heidegger's philosophy lies in reconstituting the relationship between the self and the world, not through consciousness or thought, but through the phenomenon of tools, which are fundamental elements of human life. Machines and equipment are also included among tools. These are, in fact, things necessary for work and tasks. Heidegger conceptualizes tools and equipment as readiness to hand. Readiness to hand refers not so much to an object, being spatially within the palm of the hand, but rather to a tool or piece of equipment that is within reach, or can be grasped by the hand. This is also translated as usefulness. Alternatively, it is translated as near the hand, prepared within reach, or in English, ready to hand. Here, we will refer to it as readiness to hand. It can also be described as an object that can be grasped. The meaning of readiness to hand is in use. It can also be described as in the process of working, or in the midst of labor. In other words, a tool that is in use is said to be ready to hand. That is, when one is working with a tool, machine, or piece of equipment, that tool, machine, and equipment are described as being ready to hand. Therefore, once the work is finished, and those tools and equipment are no longer needed and are put away, they cease to be readiness to hand and become presence at hand. These two modes where a tool is either in use or not in use constitute a key motif in Heidegger's thought. Presence at hand. Unlike tools held in the hand and moved, Heidegger refers to objects that have left the human hand, or were unrelated to the working hand from the outset as presence at hand. For Heidegger, the meaning of all being is always discovered, centered on readiness to hand. What is simply visible to us, that is, presence at hand, is regarded as a derivative form of being, readiness to hand. Presence at hand is also translated as before I being. It is also called simply presence. Generally, Heidegger's presence at hand is synonymous with object. In other words, the terms object, entity, or thing that we commonly use correspond to Heidegger's presence at hand. What is interesting is that we do not usually view things as objects. It is only when a tool or object breaks, or when something seems amiss, that presence at hand Vorhandenheit in German becomes apparent. For example, if a hammer breaks, we exclaim, "What on earth is this?" and look at the broken hammer. In other words, the breakage of readiness to hand reveals the presence at hand. This is Heidegger's groundbreaking insight. Breakage reveals presence. This is also the logic behind Shakespeare's King Lear. Let's look at Heidegger's text.
The ready to hand is not grasped theoretically at all, nor is it itself the sort of thing that circumspection takes proximally as a circumspective theme. That with which our everyday dealings proximally dwell is not the tools themselves die Werkzeuge selbst. On the contrary, that with which we concern ourselves primarily is the work that which is to be produced at the time, and this is accordingly ready to hand too. The work bears with it that referential totality within which the equipment is encountered. Heidegger, Being, and Time, translated by John McQuarrie and Edward Robinson, p. 99.
In what follows, this book will be referred to as B.T. Writing, pencil, the ready to hand. Let's take the example from the text above. Suppose we are writing with a pencil. The situation of writing with a pencil is a prime example that best illustrates the concept of the ready to hand. When we hold a pencil to write, our attention is not actually focused on the object of the pencil itself. The pencil in our hand recedes into the background as if it had vanished, and our attention is focused solely on what we intend to write, that is, on writing. The pencil functions naturally in accordance with its purpose, held in our hand in a way that is already usable without us consciously looking at it. At this moment, the pencil is integrated into a kind of instrumental context, and only holds meaning within the overall structural framework of the act of writing. One point worth noting here is that when an object or tool is properly fulfilling its function, it goes unnoticed. The same applies to human relationships. A person who is doing their usual work properly does not stand out. However, if they suffer an accident, get into a fight, or are injured and unable to work, they become noticeable. Therefore, going unnoticed means that work, objects, or functioning people are in a normal state, and that such things suddenly become noticeable when their function is paralyzed, a part is missing, or they are rendered unusable due to loss of health or similar reasons. Or, in a family, it is only after a member disappears or dies that their existence and significance are recalled. The so-called empty space becomes visible. Heidegger and Shakespeare point out this phenomenon of the uselessness. Secondly, objects, tools, or people that suddenly catch the eye attract attention, prompting us to closely examine their broken or diseased state. Philosophically speaking, such objects are thematized and explicitly become the subject of observation. The concept of thematizing an object through such abnormality constitutes a key element in Heidegger's philosophy and Shakespearean tragedy. In other words, sudden abnormalization establishes an object, be it a thing or a person, as a subject. In other words, it makes them stand out. The loss of function or parts demands our recognition of the object. It is recognition through loss. Returning to the example of using a pencil, the moment the pencil breaks or fails to write, it finally stands out as the object of concern. We find ourselves staring at the pencil. The pencil's existence, that is, the pencil as an object, is established. In this way, the ready-to-hand represents an existential structure in which the tool, precisely when it functions, most naturally, disappears from consciousness. This is also the most everyday and fundamental way we relate to the world. The ready-to-hand conceals itself. That is, the uniqueness of the primary ready-to-hand is that, by being ready-to-hand, it conceals itself, and precisely because of this, it is originally the ready-to-hand. He stated that the ready-to-hand, that is, a tool or material in use, conceals its own existence. A tool or material must remain unnoticed and hidden in order to perform its original function. In fact, a tool is not noticeable when it is being used properly. This fact later plays a significant role in deriving the concept of the presence at hand and the concept of the world as its totality. The theme that something is true only when it performs its function in concealment is also a crucial moment in King Lear. King Lear's youngest daughter, Cordelia, is a person of this sort. Deliberately displaying filial piety in a conspicuous manner should be seen as concealing some underlying truth. The things that are important and precious in our lives are not easily visible. A hammer for driving nails is solid. Instrumental existence is not fundamentally grasped. First, through theoretical concepts or analysis, we do not primarily perceive a hammer as a physical object with length, weight, and material, but rather experience it within its practical function, as a tool for driving nails. Mechanical and physical explanations are secondary, that is, we come to know them later. In this way, Heidegger's ontology differs from the modern Cartesian world mentioned above. It views things not as physical objects, but in a practical, existential manner. Practical seeing precedes theoretical, objective seeing. Readiness-to-hand and tools are often equated. However, as mentioned above, the ready-to-hand refers to a tool in use. A tool that is not in use is presence at hand, I. Therefore, the ready-to-hand emerges when the will of the user or worker acts upon the tool. See Heidegger's readiness-to-hand, the objectification of will, due to the difficulty in grasping Zuhandenheit. The English-speaking world translates it as ready-to-hand. If we were to express this in traditional philosophical terms, we might call it the unity of subject and object. In other words, it is the act of treating an object such as a hammer as a subject of will, or the objective expression of will. The process by which the will becomes objectified is what constitutes readiness to hand. In contrast, presence to hand, or Vorhandenheit in German, refers to the objects we simply see every day. The presence at hand refers to things upon which our will cannot act. The concept of looking around, observation, sensation, and vision also appear in Heidegger's phenomenology. First, let's call the act of looking closely observation. However, most of our everyday seeing does not involve looking closely at something, but rather glancing over it roughly. In Being and Time, this rough glancing is called looking around. In contrast, observation is explicit seeing. Explicit means looking with a specific focus. In contrast, looking around is implicit and lacks a specific focus. Its purpose is not to recognize objects, but rather to view the world in order to determine one's own position. More specifically, it is the perspective through which Dasein, being there, establishes its position. This always involves both tools and materials. Furthermore, it is said that readiness to hand, or instrumental being, is not initially explicitly thematized. Even within looking around Umsicht in German or in English, circumspection is not initially made explicit as a subject. Just as we do not consciously look at or analyze a doorknob. When opening a door, tools require almost no attention, or focus from our gaze and function like a transparent background. However, it is only when a tool breaks down, or when such instrumental means are not present in our surroundings, that this existence, that is, the existence in use, emerges from its hidden state to highlight its necessity. The ready-to-hand and the present at hand alternate. The question of whether we use a tool or not is not addressed in Being and Time. Instead, the process by which readiness to hand transforms into presence at hand, as the tool breaks down is analyzed in great detail. Heidegger's concept of truth, unconcealment, and aletheia. Unconcealment is Heidegger's concept of truth. Simply put, Heidegger's famous concept of unconcealment can be understood as truth, being like the true face that emerges after removing a mask. In other words, Heidegger views truth as a phenomenon that emerges by shattering concealment and disguise. This is the concept of truth as unconcealment. However, both concealment and unconcealment possess equal standing. It is not the case that one is true and the other is false. To put it another way, the concealed and disguised and the unconcealed and revealed are two sides of the same coin. Therefore, I understand Heidegger's truth as a dialectical union of concealment and unconcealment. Such truth as unconcealment or truth, emerging from the breaking of the shell, and for this unconcealment, negative elements such as loss, inadequacy, breakdown, collapse, and resistance are essential. This structure reveals Heidegger's truth. Moreover, this structure can be observed throughout Shakespeare's tragedies. In English literature, this is referred to as awareness through loss. It is also the phenomenon of the empty space mentioned. Above that is the empty space of the dead. As noted earlier, the loss of a function or an accessory demands the recognition of the object. In the play King Lear, the true emotions of life and interpersonal relationships are revealed when the everyday human and power structures of the court are shattered, and those who held wealth and power are stripped of their facades. The original nature of humanity emerges. However, Heidegger's concealment and unconcealment are two sides of the same coin. Sucker the problem of looking around, theorization, and thematization. While discussing readiness to hand, Heidegger introduces the concepts of thematization and theorization. In other words, readiness to hand is in a state of non-theorization and non-thematization. Science is the theoretical grasping of things. To be theoretical means, first and foremost, to express things mathematically. For instance, saying today's temperature is -10 degrees is far more scientific than saying it's cold today. Where there is matter, there is geometry, said the modern physicist Johannes Kepler. As this scientism spread widely, Western society began to view even the realm of the mind through a mathematical and scientific lens. However, in his analysis of Dasein, Heidegger regards this theoretical scientific world not as the primordial world, but rather as a derived one. The starting point for this endeavor is precisely the problem of readiness to hand. As stated in the passage above, what is ready to hand cannot be grasped theoretically, nor does it itself become the primary object of contemplation.
Prior to this sentence, Heidegger noted that when using a hammer to strike, we do not thematically grasp this entity as an object before our eyes, nor as the act of using it based on knowledge of the tool's structure itself. BTP 110.
The fact that we can immerse ourselves in work without such thematic grasping is partly because, through prior learning, the use of the tool has already become like an extension of the body. The structure of the tool itself may also have been learned initially, through instruction or by consulting manuals. This is particularly evident in the playing of musical instruments. In any case, the concept of readiness to hand that Heidegger discusses is a characteristic of human activity, in which the object and the body move as one. That is, tools are machines created to enhance the functions of bodily organs, particularly the hands and arms. Therefore, in the use of tools, there is no distinction between the self and the object. That is, the distinction between subject and object does not exist. It is against this backdrop that Heidegger conceived the concept of readiness to hand. This concept actually corresponds to the non-intentional experience. In Husserl's phenomenology, intentionality is a characteristic of consciousness that grasps an object as an object. In contrast, non-intentional experience refers to situations where, for example, I am in pain or I am cold, where the experience is clear but the object of that experience is unknown. Therefore, the phenomenon where Heidegger's readiness to hand and presence at hand intersect is, in Husserlian terms, equivalent to the intersection of non-intentional and intentional experience. Readiness to hand is an extension of the body. However, readiness to hand, the existence in which objects and the human body become one, does not stop there but looks further ahead. In other words, each of the minor tasks of daily life has no meaning in and of itself. Even the act of driving a nail into a wall with a hammer is merely a means to and a measure taken so that humans may live comfortably, at ease, happily, and well. All tools point toward some purpose. This purpose lies at the end of the task life, fulfillment, and happiness. Shi, readiness to hand and the purpose of life. Heidegger's concept of readiness to hand is linked to the concept of the purpose of life. This is called teleological indication. It adds the supplementary concept of reference to the traditional concept of purpose. Therefore, Heidegger referred to purpose simply as in order to in English, or zu in German. In this context, Heidegger emphasizes that the relationship between humans and tools always takes place within a teleological structure of in order to zu. In traditional terms, this is the relationship between end and means. Machines and tools are merely means. Consequently, we do not view tools as individual, independent objects, but rather use them naturally within a given network of reference, that is, within a totality of reference. As Heidegger noted above, the work of art, retains within itself the totality of reference, in which we encounter tools. Here, the totality of reference means, for example, that a hammer exists to drive a nail. A nail exists to secure a board. And this teleological connection continues to expand into other uses and worldly contexts. In this way, tools always derive their meaning from the totality of reference, that is, the sum of various references. Here's the collapse of means and the recognition of purpose. When we observe the phenomenon of readiness to hand, while using tools to work, we see that the starting point for human understanding of the world is not the structure through which the perceiving subject views objects, but rather the human being as a being already active and forming relationships within the world, that is, Dasein German for being there. Dasein is thus a being situated at the center of instrumental activity. As an example, the distinction between readiness to hand and presence at hand is possible through care as the root of the worker. As such a Dasein, humans were, first and foremost, beings who use tools. Tools exist within the flow of activity as the way they are used and function, and it is only when their function is interrupted or they break down, that is, when they become problematic, that the nature of the tool rises to the surface. Only then can the tool be analyzed or made the subject of inquiry. And the teleological reference mentioned above, along with its association, that is, the entire reference association becomes apparent. In other words, it is at this moment that the world, having been hidden, finally reveals itself. This is called unveiling. It reveals itself after having been hidden. In other words, this means that true recognition is achieved only when the structure and order of the work are disrupted, when it loses its function, or when it collapses. This aspect also aligns with the structure of King Lear, which will be discussed in detail later. Specifically, the relationship between King Lear and his true daughter Cordelia, as well as the dramatic scenes involving the loyal Gloucester and his loyal son Edgar. Therefore, Heidegger rejects the traditional philosophical approach of seeking the essence of things through abstract cognition, and presents practice, activity, and Dasein as more fundamental dimensions. This sentence succinctly reveals his philosophical stance, that the way we live in the world begins not with theoretical observation but with practical use and action. Furthermore, the aforementioned referential totality is Heidegger's core concept, stating that the mode of being of a tool is understood, not in terms of the attributes of an isolated object, but within a relational context. Tools and the world. Martin Heidegger viewed tools as deriving their meaning from a functional chain, in which they are always used for what, and within what task. For example, a hammer points to a nail to a plank to the activity of building, and building to the broader human purpose of dwelling. These references are not fragmented connections, but are interwoven to form a single holistic structure. And it is precisely this whole that constitutes referential totality. Since this concept of the whole interweaves instrumental activities and ultimately points to the final endpoint of that activity, that is, the purpose of the work, the concept of the whole inevitably emerges in the use of tools. One issue we discover here is that the world is derived through this structure of the whole. That is, in the state of readiness to hand, the tool itself is not objectified, and thus one cannot think of the tool as a single tool. Just as when one is deeply engrossed in work, the hammer, nails, and boards appear as a single unit. Here, it is not a process. where individual elements come together to form a whole.
Therefore, from the author's perspective, the world only emerges when the readiness to hand transforms into the presence at hand, and purposeful connections and reference wholeness are added to it.
In other words, the phenomena of the world only come into being once we develop the awareness that the objects before our eyes, such as a hammer, a nail, and a plank, do not simply exist individually, but rather form a single whole. I will discuss this point in more detail later. Savoir, unprepared tools. Above, we discuss the specific mode of being of readiness to hand, that is, the entity in the hand, or the entity graspable by the hand, or das Zuhandene. When the readiness to hand is disrupted, that entity reveals itself. In Heidegger's terms, this occurs when readiness to hand become unusable when they are not in their place, when they do not fit the hand, or when they are not where the hand reaches. What is at hand appears as presence before the eyes. For example, when dissatisfaction arises, such as, there is no hammer here, or these gloves do not fit my hands. Only then is the presence before the eyes of the hammer and gloves demanded. Prior to that, the presence of these instrumental entities, that is, their being before the eyes, was concealed. In this way, the worldliness of the world emerges anew. That is, when we encounter the world and things, we do not initially perceive the hammer as a physical object with length, weight, and material, but rather experience it within its practical function as a tool for driving nails. Mechanical and physical explanations come later. Heidegger describes this phenomenological context as follows.
When we concern ourselves with something, the entities which are most closely ready to hand may be met as something unusable, not properly adapted for the use we have decided upon. The tool turns out to be damaged, or the material unsuitable. In each of these cases, equipment is here, ready to hand. We discover its unusability, however, not by looking at it and establishing its properties, but rather by the circumspection of the dealings in which we use it. When its unusability is thus discovered, equipment becomes conspicuous. BTP 102.
In this paragraph, concepts characteristic of Heidegger's epistemology, such as damage, unusability, conspicuous, which characterize Heidegger's epistemology, are brought to light. When readiness to hand or objects within reach encounter unreadiness, breakdown, damage, and inadequacy, the perspective of the task shifts to a looking around. Let us examine Heidegger's explanation of the shift in perspective, from readiness to hand to presence at hand once more.
Again, to miss something in this way amounts to coming across something unready to hand. When we notice what is unready to hand, that which is ready to hand enters the mode of obtrusiveness. The more urgently Dringlisher we need what is missing, and the more authentically it is encountered in its unreadiness to hand, all the more obtrusive so auf Dringlisher does that which is ready to hand become so much so, indeed, that it seems to lose its character of readiness to hand. It reveals itself as something just present at hand and no more, which cannot be budged without the thing that is missing. The helpless way in which we stand before it is a deficient mode of concern, and as such it uncovers the being just present at hand and no more of something ready to hand. BTP 103.
The feeling of urgency through loss. As seen in this example, the readiness to hand transforms into a presence at hand when it breaks down. When a single part is missing from a machine or tool, rendering it unusable, the worker first frantically searches for the missing part. The urgency or desperation in the above sentence describes such a situation. The more indispensable the missing or broken part is, the more intense this feeling becomes. One cries out, "Where did this go?" while searching for the missing part. Heidegger describes this state somewhat paradoxically, as readiness to hand is not ready to hand. This refers to a situation where a tool is held in the hand, but cannot perform its function due to a malfunction or the loss of a part. Heidegger calls this a state of functional emptiness. Emptiness means the tool cannot perform its original task. He also expresses it as readiness to hand imposing its necessity. It is a descriptive technique that suggests the tool is alive and appealing to the person, the worker, about its own state of incapacity. It is as if I have lost some important tool or equipment, and because the necessity of that tool is so critical, the tool itself seems to be crying out its own urgency. Of course, in reality, it is I, the owner of that tool or equipment, who feels this way. Heidegger describes this emotion and use as the psychological state of care. Care simply refers to the user's state of mind. In this context, standing before the tool at a loss is described as a deficient form of care. It refers to the situation of a worker standing in a daze after a machine part falls out or becomes damaged while working. A tool that suddenly appears as a thing that is, as a presence right before one's eyes must now be dealt with. However, the broken tool has not yet been put away. It is still in the hand. That is why Heidegger described above that one discovers the mere presence of something in one's hand. Here, the meaning is that the tool has become unusable, so one is simply looking at it. Mere presence hinders work. Heidegger describes this as mere presence. However, a tool that cannot be used and is merely present, that is, a broken tool or machine, appears as an obstacle to the worker's state of mind or care. The reason is that human concern or care causes one to look at the tool with the expectation of resuming the activity one was previously engaged in, even if the tool is broken. Since the work has come to a halt, the worker perceives the breakdown as an obstruction. A broken tool evokes emotions such as obstruction, resistance, and endurance. Heidegger describes this simply as a form of care. The discovery of the world through lack. Heidegger later referred to this as the structure of A as B. Here we discover a formula, the discovery of being through lack. Let us call this, more simply, the discovery of the world through lack. This resonates with the theme of Shakespearean tragedy, which we will discuss shortly, awareness through loss. From here on, we will examine the process by which what is in the hand, namely the ready-to-hand, transforms into what is before the eyes, namely the present at hand, leading to the emergence of the world as the totality of beings before our eyes. Various forms of unready-to-hand. Heidegger introduces the term the unready-to-hand. Let's look at the text.
In our dealings with the world, one of our concern, the unready-to-hand, can be encountered not only in the sense of that which is unusable or simply missing, but as something unready to hand, which is not missing at all and not unusable, but which stands in the way of our concern, that to which our concern refuses to turn, that for which it has no time, is something unready to hand in the manner of what does not belong here, of what has not as yet been attended to. BTP 103.
The loss of meaning in the ready-to-hand appears not only in tool being but also in various situations of life. That is, it is not merely the case of work being interrupted by a broken tool or unsuitable materials. Even a being that simply hinders the work, a being lying in the way, can be encountered as something unready to hand. Thus, the ready-to-hand refers to practical and utilitarian existence. When the ready-to-hand is lacking or hindered, the nature of presence before one's eyes comes to the fore. Furthermore, situational and temporal factors that hinder the task negate readiness to hand and shift it toward unready to hand. Thus, in the passage above, Heidegger states that what one cannot reach, because there is no time, does not belong here, and is not ready to hand in the manner of something left unfinished. For example, when you're knitting but have to stop because you're out of time, the knitting tools and yarn lose their original character, that is, their readiness to hand, and simply exist before your eyes as knitting needles and yarn. They are present at hand. A Shakespeare transition through conspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy. Tools that are denied use are not simply discarded, but are seen as engaging in a form of resistance.
Let's look at the text. The modes of conspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy all have the function of bringing to the fore the characteristic of presence at hand in what is ready to hand. But the ready to hand is not thereby just observed and stared at as something present at hand. The presence at hand, which makes itself known, is still bound up in the readiness to hand of equipment. Such equipment still does not veil itself in the guise of mere things. It becomes equipment in the sense of something which one would like to shove out of the way. But in such a tendency to shove things aside, the ready-to-hand shows itself as still ready to hand in its unswerving presence at hand. BTP 104.
Here, Heidegger redefines the attitude of Dasein toward a broken tool or machine, that is, care. Through this, he gradually brings forth the phenomenon of the world. Care toward a broken tool involves, as in the above quotation, conspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy. A new form of care or looking around called conspicuousness emerges. These feelings arise from a broken object. Conspicuousness is easy to understand. That is, an object that was originally ready to hand does not readily catch the eye. The readiness to hand is fundamentally unconspicuous. The mode of perception, known as surveying, sometimes involves intuiting tools and equipment without even looking at them. For example, skilled chefs can slice vegetables without looking. A knife used on a cutting board suddenly becomes clearly visible only when a finger is cut by it. Therefore, conspicuousness occurs when an object in one's hand ceases to function and transforms into an object right before one's eyes. Obtrusiveness and obstinacy, and the emotion of obstinacy is, in fact, more accurately described as being coerced. That is, even if a tool or piece of equipment breaks down, the person working does not give up but wants to keep going. In other words, they are coerced into continuing to work, even with a broken object. This can also be described as a law of inertia. Humans have a tendency to continue what they are doing. They must proceed until the task is completed without interruption. Finally, obtrusiveness refers to the tool's defiance. Even if the person wants to continue working, the broken tool resists that tendency. Therefore, obtrusiveness and obstinacy represent opposing directions of action. In other words, the law of action and reaction between the human trying to force the work and the tool preventing it. In this situation of work cessation, the object before one's eyes, the presence, almost pure thing standing on its own, without relation to human concern or care, doesn't remains 100% established. Heidegger described this above by stating that the tool has not yet revealed itself as a pure thing. However, he also notes that even in the process, where the entity in one's hand resists care and attention, and even within that tendency to resist the entity in one's hand, still reveals itself as such, through its firm presence right before one's eyes, a visibility, compulsion, and resistance in King Lear. In the above quotation, Heidegger states that the modes of conspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy serve to bring the presence at hand of the readiness to hand to the forefront. This logic is also evident in King Lear. When the existing order collapses, the hierarchical structure of harmonious relationships is disrupted, and the succession of power in the kingdom is not prepared in the usual way, that is, according to custom and history, the superior in the human order, namely the king, intuitively perceives the modes of conspicuousness, obtrusiveness, and obstinacy in the attitudes of his subordinates. Consequently, the king fails to understand his silent daughter's pure heart and perceives it as a rebellion against his authority. That is, King Lear becomes enraged upon seeing and hearing Cordelia's strange behavior, her somewhat taciturn words and actions. Seeing that Cordelia cannot follow in her sister's footsteps by submitting to power and even abusing parental love, Lear regards this as conspicuous and irritating behavior. He views his daughter, who believes that loving her father is a given, and sees little need to say, more as ignoring his fatherly wish for something more, and instead asserting herself. In Heidegger's world of tools and objects, this is considered an act of obtrusiveness. Mise, purpose and means, reference totality, readiness to hand, that is, the use of tools. And the act of working can sometimes consist of a single process, but usually involves multiple processes. In other words, as mentioned earlier, work consists of various processes and elements, such as a hammer, nails, plywood, construction, and housings. Furthermore, there are various types of tools and implements. The breakdown of objects or tools also occurs within this context of interrelation. If we look at a so-called tool set, we can see the interrelationships among the tools. To further explore these complex circumstances, the concept of reference or reference totality is required. This, of course, has already been discussed earlier in this essay. Let us recollect Heidegger's text. Reference is the relationship between means and end. That is, when we say B is used for A, this configuration is called reference. Heidegger avoids using terms from traditional philosophy as much as possible. This is because, in his view, such terms and concepts lack phenomenological rigor and clarity. For example, he rarely uses terms such as subject, object, and cognition. Furthermore, the totality of reference refers to a teleological connection. He defined the existential structure of the readiness to hand as a tool through reference.
The care that uses things while not clearly attending to their unique and self-evident readiness to hand, which can encounter the unusable. In this case, the structure of reference is also interrupted. A tool can become unusable. It is precisely here that the constitutive reference, in which foredoing points to for it, is obstructed. Reference itself is not being examined, rather, it is present there while being followed with care there. Yet, amidst the disruption of indication in the very place where it cannot be used, the indication becomes clear. B.T.
P. Yinsalter. Heidegger is now speaking about the existential structure of the readiness to hand. It is precisely indication. Moreover, the indicativity that appears here is also directly linked to the readiness to hand. When things are going smoothly, the readiness to hand goes unnoticed. Yet, in reality, the readiness to hand moves within the invisible connectivity of indication. Heidegger analyzes indicativity more concretely as foredoing and for it, stating that foredoing indicates for it. Thus, in the preceding paragraph, Heidegger limited the existence of the readiness to hand to that of a tool. In this way, tools, that is, tools in use, receive indication. As stated in the text, foredoing, pointing to, for it, that is, a constitutive indication, and during operation, that is, when the machine runs smoothly without breaking down, indicativity is concealed. Yet, interest in the machine or tool remains ever present. This living concern, like that for tools, is care. This care must be seen as lying beneath the structure of indication. However, when situations such as breakdowns, disruptions, or interference arise, that aspect of indication, namely, the coercive nature of the tool's function and use, comes to the fore. This is why the passage above states, in the midst of the disruption of indication, indication becomes evident. Foredoing, for that. Here, foredoing German refers to the purpose of an object, while for that, German dazu refers to its method of use. In other words, foredoing denotes the purpose of the work, for example. Dwelling, while for that, refers to the specific details of the work, activity, such as hammering. The purpose of dwelling directs the specific detail of hammering. Once the goal of a task is given, the specific processes are derived from it. Heidegger referred to this above as constitutive indication. This is commonly called the work process. Once the goal of a task is determined, the work process is derived. Heidegger's indication, or indicative totality, is actually similar to the concept of teleology in traditional philosophy. That is, it is a way of explaining the existence and function of things through the relationship between means and ends. As mentioned earlier, for example, a hammer is for driving nails. Nails are for joining plywood and timber. The joining of plywood and timber is for the activity of building, and building points to the broader human purpose of dwelling. These indications are not merely fragmented connections, but are intertwined to fulfill a single purpose. Therefore, what Heidegger refers to as indication totality is simply another expression of teleology. However, what Heidegger emphasizes here is that this concept of indication usually remains unnoticed. It only becomes evident when its indicativeness is disrupted by a malfunction or obstacle. Heidegger thus takes this further. To understand this simply, one can rephrase indicativeness as teleology. If we reinterpret Heidegger's indicativeness in a teleological or intentional sense, meaning that the purpose requires the means or the purpose indicates the means. From another perspective, when we encounter obstacles while going about our daily lives, we are compelled to reconsider the ultimate purpose of that endeavor. For example, suppose we work hard to earn money so that our children can go to school. When we can no longer earn money and lose our jobs, we think about the ultimate purpose, our children's future, and feel even greater sorrow. In other words, we become pessimistic, thinking that our child will be unable to study and that their future will be bleak. Interpreted teleologically, we earn money in order to ensure our child receives a good education. That is, the means are dictated by the end. However, the logic is that when the means collapse, we come to recognize the purpose anew. This serves as a concrete analogy for the concepts of in order to, and for that, dazu, that Heidegger spoke of. Being in itself. The next important point we will examine is the concept of being in itself. In German, this is an sich, and in English, in itself. This term is commonly referred to as being in itself. It is a concept widely known through Sartre's concepts of being in itself and being for others. Originally, being in itself implies existing on its own, being unaffected by others, or existing in an original, unmediated state. It shares the same meaning as essence. Therefore, the opposite of this term is being for others. However, Heidegger interprets the being in itself of things in terms of readiness to hand, care, and pointing. In other words, this interpretation differs from the original concept of being in itself. However, Heidegger interprets it within the context of readiness to hand, specifically within the context of a network of indications, and the totality of indications. Therefore, the essence or self-being of a thing is actually readiness to hand, and within the network of indications that connects them, its essence, self-being, or being in itself is revealed. Furthermore, Heidegger states that the concept of the world as a whole was already potentially present within the act of looking around. Thus, Heidegger expressed that the tool relation does not shine forth as a whole that has never been seen before, but rather as a whole that has always been seen from the very beginning within the act of looking around. He stated that the world reveals itself together with this whole B. T. 1018. In other words, he emphasizes that the world reveals itself together with this whole. Here, Heidegger's intention is to express that the world is not an abstract concept but a seen whole. He is saying that the world is seen and perceived behind our consciousness as we look at individual objects. The image of the world is already hidden. Looking around and grasping the whole, even in a looking around that is a casual view, without explicit focus on a specific subject, Heidegger states that in this glance the world always shines forth from the very beginning, as a whole that has already been seen. Here, the totality, a constituent element of the concept of the world, finally emerges. The world as we commonly understand it refers to the totality of things. Therefore, Heidegger wrote that the world reveals itself through this totality. However, this totality is not merely the totality of things, it includes referential totality, as well as the modes of use that follow, and meaningfulness. In this context, Heidegger states,
"The fact that the world does not come into being from what is in the hand reveals, among other things, the following, namely, that in the modes of care interpreted above, the shining of the world and the goes hand in hand with it a worlding of the readiness to hand, and thus the fact that mere presence at hand is brought to the fore in this readiness to hand, being in time." From Korean translation p. 119.
Here, it is declared that the appearance of the world goes hand in hand with the de-worlding of the readiness to hand. This is precisely what is explained immediately afterward, namely, the fact that mere presence at hand is brought to the fore in this readiness to hand. Here we must examine Heidegger's 4 definitions of the world. First, the first definition is as follows. That is, the world is used as an existential concept, and, in this case, signifies the totality of entities that can exist within the world before one's eyes. Being and time, p. 104. This is the commonly used concept of the world. The author conducts this analysis based on the passage in the above quotation, namely the stipulation that the shining of the world and the de-worlding of the readiness to hand go hand in hand. That is, if the world refers to the totality of things before one's eyes, then the shining of the world implies that the readiness to world withdraw from it. In other words, neutral visual existence abandons the readiness to hand. As analyzed above, readiness to hand refers to the relationship between the worker and the tool. Therefore, when the world before one's eyes is highlighted, instrumental and utilitarian existence naturally withdraws from it. This is the meaning of the concept of de-worlding. Yasker, panoramic view of the whole. The world is thus accompanied by the comprehensive highlighting of what is before one's eyes. However, the world is not merely a single presence before one's eyes. Even among these immediate presences, a connection of indication totality is required. Therefore, the world is only possible when the things before one's eyes are connected through the categories of totality and intentionality, rather than remaining in a state of isolation. Thus, Heidegger stated the following.
The instrumental relationship shines forth not as a whole that has never been seen before, but as a whole that has always been seen from the very beginning in the act of looking around. Together with this whole, the world reveals itself. Being in time, p. 118.
The meaning hidden here is that the whole has already been seen in the act of looking around. The whole here refers to the tool relatedness. In other words, the act of looking around, that is, cognition may not fully grasp the whole at first, but upon closer examination, it reveals that the concept of tool-related notion of wholeness, was already concealed within it. However, as seen in the expression the whole that has been seen, the whole was not grasped through thought but sensually, that is, visually. In other words, what is revealed in the act of looking is the whole. Here, revealed means that, for instance, when there is a referential totality such as driving a nail with a hammer, then connecting planks, then constructing a building, and finally setting the goal of comfortable habitation, one can intuitively perceive these various stages visually, one after another, as if viewing a panoramic photograph. This is the meaning of the intuitive whole that Heidegger speaks of. The world is the completion or referential totality of the beings, before one's eyes, grasped intuitively in this way. Although they are beings before one's eyes, the objects connected by this referentiality are precisely the world. Let us look at the main text.
In order to encounter the tool in one's hand in its readiness to hand amidst the everyday care of the surrounding world, the indication and indicatory totality in which this looking is immersed must remain non-thematically present not only for this looking but also for the thematic grasping as well. The fact that the world does not reveal itself is the condition of possibility for the object in one's hand not to emerge from its own invisibility. And within this lies the phenomenal structure of this being's own being in time, p. 119.
What we can first discern from this passage is that the so-called surveying of perception carries the meaning of being non-thematic. The entity before one's eyes is what makes thematic perception possible. However, Heidegger states that this indication and the totality of indication must also remain as a non-thematic grasp. In other words, he asserts that the intentional indication must also remain, non-thematically, that is, implicitly or potentially. Only in this case can one know the entity's own, that is, its essence can be known. Furthermore, the statement that the world's failure to reveal itself is the condition of possibility for the readiness to hand not to emerge from its own invisibility applies to the first meaning of the world mentioned above. The world's failure to reveal itself is equivalent to the de-worlding discussed earlier. That is, only through de-worlding can the readiness to hand be grasped in its original mode, that is, as invisibility, non-imposition, and non-persistence. In other words, it functions as a tool. The relationship between intra-worldly being and the world. Above, we studied the readiness to hand, the presence at hand. That is, the emergence of the presence at hand through the breakage of the presence at hand, and the emergence of the concept of the world through knowledge and referential totality. Heidegger later defines this as the worldliness of the world. Here, the concept of meaningfulness is added. Significance is also similar to referential totality. However, significance is a concept that further expands upon the previously mentioned, doing for and for it. That is, for doing, for what, and for whom, that is, worum willen in German, are further connected through intentionality. Therefore, Heidegger states the following.
Worldliness was interpreted above, section 18, as the totality of reference of meaningfulness. The referential connection of meaningfulness is fixed in Dasein zone, most proper being in itself. Being in time, p. 186.
Recognition through loss. Humanity in Shakespeare's King Lear. Above, we saw how crucial the concepts of breakdown and loss are in Heidegger's phenomenology, specifically when the readiness to hand as a tool breaks down. That readiness to hand is discovered as the presence at hand, and in that process the relationality of tool beings, that is, their indicativity is thematically recognized. In other words, prior to the breakdown, the network of purposeful indicatory relations is not visible and remains unconscious. For example, tasks like hammering or drilling are such self-evident routines that when performing them, we do not look closely at the tools or consciously consider their purpose. In other words, we do not think about why we are hammering, we simply move. According to the established routine of hammering, in Husserl's terms, this process lacks intentionality. That is, objectivity is not established. The concept of the entity in the hand is also a concept devised and applied by the phenomenologist, observing the action, not by the person performing it. No one performing tool-based work is conscious that they are currently dealing with the readiness to hand. That is, they cannot grasp it thematically, but simply plod along, performing the task assigned to them. Especially in fast-paced work, thematic grasp and objectivity disappear even further. In other words, the readiness to hand cannot appear in consciousness, of course the mode of observation known as looking around, does pay attention to certain characteristics of the machine, or tool to some extent, but it remains incomplete. To put it bluntly, one could say that the readiness to hand and the presence at hand appear alternately. Then, when the machine breaks down, it catches the eye, and through a process of resistance and rebellion, the tool is discarded and left to languish. At this point, the entity before one's eyes comes to the fore. It then follows the path of thematization, objectification, and consciousness. In this process, the interconnectedness of tools and materials, that is, their indexicality and total indexicality, which had been hidden until then, is properly recognized through the machine's breakdown. This is the world. In Heidegger's terminology, this is the worldliness of the world. Therefore, Heidegger's concept of Dasein and his theory of the world can be simply described as the recognition of true being through loss. In other words, this is consistent with what is known as unconcealment. Heidegger states that truth is unconcealment. Unconcealment does not mean simply accepting what is concealed as it is, but rather casting off the disguise to reveal the true form. When the readiness to hand, that is, the tool breaks, it is no longer an object to be used, but is unconcealed as a presence at hand. The whole is already grasped. In other words, it is exposed as a being before the eye. It is like taking off one's clothes and becoming naked. It sheds the clothing of readiness to hand and appears as presence at hand. Shakespeare's tragedy, King Lear, and Heidegger's philosophy of unworldliness. In literature and in our lives, such cases are often expressed as awareness through loss. It could also be described as awareness through the missing. As we saw earlier, Heidegger's theory explores how deficiency of equipment or damage of readiness to hand reveals presence at hand, and upon this foundation, the nature of the world is revealed. A similar logic is vividly depicted in Shakespeare's tragedies. Among them, King Lear provides the most apt example. Cordelia, Lear's loyal youngest daughter, is banished from court because she does not receive her father's love. The narrative skillfully reveals how King Lear, having failed to see the truth, only comes to fully recognize his youngest daughter's sincerity and love after being stripped bare and wandering in the wilderness. In contrast to her sister's well-rehearsed speeches, the youngest daughter, Cordelia, expresses the truth, not with words, but from the depths of her heart. Unlike her sisters, who display their eloquence with flowery rhetoric, as if in a speech contest on the theme of love. She initially says she has nothing to say, but when her father presses her repeatedly, she expresses her feelings as follows.
Lear, nothing comes from nothing, say it again. Cordelia, I, wretched as I am, cannot pour out my heart with my mouth. I love you, your majesty, as my duty commands. No more, no less. Lear, how, Cordelia? Reword your speech, lest you ruin your fate. Cordelia, gracious father, you gave me birth, raised me, and loved me. I shall duly repay that grace by following you, loving you, and hold you in the highest esteem. My sisters all claim to love you, but why then have they taken husbands? When I marry, the Lord who receives my vows will take half my love, half my care, and half my duty. I will certainly not marry as my sisters have, so that I may love my father with my whole heart. King Lear, Act 1, Scene 1.
Cordelia cannot put her heart into words, so she is content to express the most basic emotions toward her parents. My loving father, who gave me birth, raised me, and loved me, I shall surely repay that kindness by following, loving, and honoring you above all, and is content to express only the most basic emotions toward her parents. However, she remains unmarried, dedicating her pure devotion to King Lear, her father and sovereign, and to the kingdom. This is akin to Elizabeth I's declaration, I am married to the state. Cordelia, who loves her father completely and loves the kingdom, may well have waited for this day, the day of succession to the throne and the kingdom, without ever marrying. In contrast, King Lear harbors no suspicion whatsoever regarding the flattery of his two elder daughters mentioned earlier. He takes their exaggerated praise at face value and acts as if deeply moved by it. For Lear, who was already advanced in age and sensing the waning of his authority, their flattery served as a comfort, seemingly reaffirming his own dignity. He believes Goneril and Regan's lip service to be proof of true love, and based solely on the flowery rhetoric they displayed, he opens his heart and hands over his lands and power to them. In particular, the more elaborate and lengthy their speeches were, the greater the trust and satisfaction Lear felt in proportion. Ultimately, Lear mistook love crafted by the tongue for the truth, choosing to listen to dazzling rhetoric rather than honest words. Cordelia's heart is, for the most part, concealed. Her love and loyalty toward her father are veiled. Similarly, the hearts of Goneril and Regan are also revealed in a veiled and distorted form. In other words, both truth and greed were concealed and veiled. Through this process, the king sets himself on the path to ruin. By ceding power to his hypocritical daughters, Goneril and Regan's flattery went beyond mere praise. It was a fatal temptation that clouded Lear's judgment, and Lear's response was the result of forgetfulness and arrogance that accepted it uncritically. Consequently, their flattery and Lear's poor judgment become the pivotal starting point of the tragic catastrophe. In this way, wealth and power become means of distorting and destroying human nature. Yes, realization through loss. Above, we introduce the story of how King Lear was betrayed by his daughters, lost his loyal youngest daughter, and was ultimately driven from his kingdom to wander the wilderness. From here on, we will follow King Lear's existential suffering, his realization, and the path leading to his death. It is only after losing everything that King Lear finally comes to understand himself and the world. At first, he relies on outward displays of loyalty, flowery words, and the illusion of power, failing to distinguish true love from falsehood. However, as he relinquishes the throne and is betrayed by his two daughters, he gradually realizes the fragility of human existence and the limits of his own arrogance. Furthermore, he finds himself wandering, naked and homeless in the midst of a storm. He laments his plight, asking, how can a homeless head, a starving body, and tattered rags possibly withstand such weather? Drifting through the storm, King Lear, in this extreme situation, recalls the plight of others in similar circumstances and appeals to the compassion of those in power for them. Thus he says, O power, take medicine, heal yourself. Reveal yourself and feel what those wretched souls feel. Let us look at the text and dialogue from the play King Lear. Here, we witness the concrete manifestation of Heidegger's concept of being with or co-presence. Going further, King Lear delivers a soliloquy, urging those in power to reveal yourselves and feel what those wretched people feel, while reflecting on his own failure to do so when he held power in the past. In this way, the loss of wealth and power through his daughter's betrayal, along with the loss of material comforts and pleasures, finally awakens in him a realistic awareness of being with, as well as compassion and empathy. Let us look at the text of King Lear.
Wretched poor people, wherever you may be, you who are enduring this merciless storm, how can you possibly withstand such weather with your homeless heads, starving bodies, and ragged, tattered clothes? Ah, I have been so indifferent to such things. Power, take medicine, heal yourself. Reveal yourself and feel what those wretched ones feel. Only then can you share your abundance with them, and show a little more justice to heaven. King Lear, Act 3, Scene 4.
The passage above illustrates how those in power, unaware of the suffering of the homeless, wield their authority, arbitrarily exposing the poor and pitiful to a merciless storm. They must take the medicine and heal themselves. Only then, it is said, can they show even a little more justice to heaven, that is, to God. The extreme loss he experiences while wandering in the storm causes him to see anew the common human destiny, the suffering of the poor, and the illusory nature of power and status. Here, if we recall the concept of Dasein from Heidegger's Being and Time, we can gain a deeper understanding of Shakespeare's anthropology. Dasein refers to human beings living together. Let us look at Being and Time.
Based on this being in the world together, the world is, at every moment, already and always the world that I share with others. The world of Dasein is a shared world. Being in the world is being with others' coexistence. The inner self-existence of the other within the world is co-presence, being there together. Being and Time, p. 180.
King Lear fought desperately until the very last moment to save Cordelia, but faced with the fact that he ultimately failed to save her, he oscillates between deep denial and despair. Unable to accept that Cordelia is dead, he repeats, "She is still breathing," displaying a psychological resistance to deny the truth even in the face of death. This is also similar to the psychology of a human worker, who refuses to acknowledge that a tool is broken and insists on continuing to work. King Lear's denial of his daughter's death is not mere grief, but a sign of deep confusion stemming from his inability to accept that his own world has collapsed. He is caught in a chaos of self-reproach and regret. love and anger, sorrow and denial. In particular, his lament, "Why must Cordelia die, while dogs and rats, those insignificant creatures, live on?" marks the moment when Lear realizes that the order of the world has collapsed. Here, we are reminded of the lesson of recognition through loss. Furthermore, it evokes the sentiment described by Heidegger regarding a broken tool, namely, the emotion of still clinging to the tool and longing to use it, even before discarding the broken object, that is, the emotional attachment, and longing for its use that persists even as we let go. In other words, this brings to mind the state of brokenness, unusability, or unsuitability of Heidegger's being as tool. That is the readiness to hand, as we noted earlier. The phenomena of visibility, compulsion, and holding. The philosophy of emptiness. Heidegger stated that the modes of standing for, compulsion, and holding on serve to bring what is present at hand to the forefront. In what is ready to hand, he said that after undergoing this process, the tool finally becomes that sort of thing, meaning the very thing people want to throw away. A similar process occurs in human relationships. In tragedy King Lear, what is shattered is not Heidegger's readiness to hand, that is, a tool or material, but the child itself. His daughter is gone, yet he has not yet come to terms with it. He holds his dead daughter and wails. Here, the heart is not about consideration but about care. Let's look at the original text of King Lear.
The child is gone forever. I know who is dead and who is alive. This child lies dead as earth. Bring me a mirror. If her breath fogs the glass, then she is still alive. This feather moves, she lives. If so, it would be the one chance to undo all the suffering I have endured. King Lear, Act 5, Scene 3.
In this scene, King Lear is in a state of clinging to his lastie, hope even amidst extreme despair. Although he is almost fully aware that his daughter Cordelia is dead, he refuses to accept it until the very end. His demand for a mirror and a feather is not an expression of reason, but of a desperate obsession and denial. In other words, he is not simply grieving. 1, in a state of psychological collapse where he cannot accept death, and 2, simultaneously clinging to a desperate hope of grasping even the faintest possibility. At this moment, Lear stands on the border between reason and madness. On the one hand, he knows reality well enough to say, "She is dead," but on the other, he seeks to confirm life in the movement of a breath or a feather. Ultimately, this scene depicts a tragic moment in human existence, the inability to accept complete loss, a state in which love is so great that it leads to a rejection of reality. Cordelia, who has already vanished, remains in King Lear's world as an empty space. Heidegger once said, "The empty is more essential." In other words, when a necessary person disappears, their necessity becomes all the more evident. The presence of the dead is demanded even more urgently. We refuse to let the departed go. This is the meaning of the phrase, "emptiness is more essential." We experience this frequently in our daily lives as well. When those around us, our family, our fellow coexistence fall, the rhythm of life collapses. Thus, the living, like King Lear above, refuse to accept even the death of the deceased. No, they rebel against and resist death. Yet ultimately they are confronted with the corpse of the deceased, that is, the presence before their eyes that no longer shows any reaction. King Lear embodies this subjective psychology of not wanting to let go of a presence held in one's hands. Faced with the death of a relative or spouse, we say, "Why were you in such a hurry to leave so soon?" In the silence of the beloved, a famous Korean poem, the poet sings, "Though you have gone, I have not sent you away." In this way, obstructing death, resisting it, and rebelling against it is the essence of human existence, that is, life. Had there been a pioneering resolve to remember death, King Lear might have escaped his extreme arrogance and avoided the human tragedy of abandoning his daughters. The awakening through loss in King Lear. Within the basic semantic structure of King Lear presented above, we can explore in greater detail the hidden semantic association of awareness through loss. This motif, awareness through loss, is one of the core tragic structures of King Lear. In this play, Shakespeare structured the narrative so that the character's true insights do not emerge at the beginning or during a time of order, but only become possible through a process of dramatic exposure. The loss of power, social status, recognition, and ultimately loved ones is not merely an external downfall, but an essential process leading to a profound existential realization. The tragedy stems from the fact that this realization comes too late to revive a life that has already been destroyed. The storm. As a site of radical exposure, the storm is the most symbolic scene in this play. It represents not only the external forces of nature, but also Lear's internal collapse. Everything that once protected him, the palace, his status, his servants, no longer exists. He stands, literally and figuratively, naked before the world. In this extreme situation, Lear realizes for the first time the injustice of his past actions. He comes to understand how much he had neglected the poverty and suffering of his subjects. The loss of his own security has forced him to see things from others' perspectives. The words he utters in the storm reveal a newly awakened moral sensibility. He comes to see not only his own suffering, but also the structural injustices of human society. Thus, the storm marks a turning point. The king becomes human. Loss strips him bare. Yet, at the same time, it enables true vision for the first time. And so, King Lear, encountering the storm in the wilderness, cries out,
"You may think it a great misfortune that this violent storm pierces our very skin, and so it may be for you. But where a greater illness has taken root, a lesser one is scarcely felt. You will flee from it as you would from a bear. But if you flee and face the raging sea, you will meet a bear within your own mouth. When the mind is free, the body grows weak. The storm within my mind robs my senses of all other feelings, leaving only the beating of my heart. Oh, ingratitude of my children!" King Lear, Act 3, Scene 4.
This soliloquy, spoken by Lear amidst the storm, reveals that the immense suffering, raging, within him is far more overwhelming than the violent storm raging outside. Furthermore, the lines "you will flee as from a bear, but if you flee and meet the raging sea, you will meet a bear in your mouth," mean that a person fleeing to escape a bear cannot avoid the bear, even upon reaching the sea, and will encounter it in an even more terrifying way, as if meeting a bear in one's own mouth, bear, and indeed encounters it in an even more horrific way, as if meeting it right in his own mouth. Heidegger's ontology and the motif of recognition through loss. We have previously examined Heidegger's concept of readiness-to-hand. The readiness-to-hand emphasizes an existential structure where the tool disappears from consciousness, precisely when it functions most naturally. This is also the most everyday and fundamental way we relate to the world. As Heidegger stated above, the uniqueness of the readiness-to-hand lies in the fact that, by being ready to hand, it conceals itself, and precisely because of this, it is originally ready to hand. He stated that a readiness to hand, that is a tool or equipment in use, conceals its own existence. A tool or equipment must remain unnoticed and hidden in order to perform its original function. In this way, ordinary beings conceal themselves. This statement must be read in a phenomenological sense. That is, it does not refer to the fact of existence. From the perspective of existing sciences or history, rather, it refers to the meaning of phenomena that emerge through intuition, not in an empirical sense. Heidegger called this kind of knowledge opening or disclosure. Let us look at being and time.
Yet that which remains hidden in an egregious sense, or which relapses and gets covered up again, or which shows itself only in disguise, is not just this entity or that, but rather the being of entities, as our previous observations have shown. This being can be covered up so extensively that it becomes forgotten, and no question arises about it or about its meaning. BTP 59.
However, this unveiling is by no means an acquisition in the general sense. It is not a way of empirically learning about this or that. It is, as in the example above, the way in which being reveals itself. Of course, this involves the observation and analysis of the philosopher, that is, the phenomenologist. The phenomenological truth obtained through this process, that is, most of Heidegger's analysis of being argues that being only experiences its essential possibility of existence through loss, damage, the collapse of familiar structures, and a departure from the world. Therefore, cognition is essentially structured negatively. In other words, as indicated in the original text above, the existence of a being is concealed, hidden, and disguised. Consequently, the truth of this state is revealed only through processes, such as loss, damage, collapse, and withdrawal. This fact was discussed in Shakespeare's play King Lear, as seen above. This section details how, in Heidegger's ontology, cognition is linked to loss, collapse, and deprivation, and why loss, in particular, constitutes the condition for a more primordial form of understanding. First, this situation was already explored in the earlier discussion of readiness to hand and presence at hand. Let us organize these points a bit further. Our concealment and appearance. Above, we examined Heidegger's concepts of concealment and disclosure. Heidegger argued that the being of a being, that is das Sein eines Seienden in German, is so deeply concealed that it is forgotten, and questions about it or its meaning are not even raised. As a concrete example, in his famous analysis, Heidegger described a tool as generally what is ready to hand, or what is grasped by the hand. It is so familiar to us that we hardly perceive it consciously. A hammer does not appear to our eyes as an object, rather. It exists as an extension of our practical actions. But how do we come to recognize the hammer as a hammer? It is not when it functions, but when it does not function, that is, when it disappears, breaks, or becomes useless. In other words, a thing does not first approach us as an object with characteristics, but as a tool bound up in our practical relationship. The hammer did not approach us as a wooden handle, a metal head, but as a tool for striking. Therefore, its meaning is not inherent in itself, but arises from the relationship of for the sake of. That is the purpose. The hammer is for striking, the nail is for fastening, a plank is for building. These referential relationships form a network of meaning, what Heidegger calls the world, that is, a totality of reference. Therefore, the world is not a space filled with things, but a structure of reference and purpose. The important point here is that objects generally remain unnoticed. When we hammer, we do not look at the hammer. Its function works behind the scenes to maintain the stability of the world. This is the loss, damage, collapse, and deprivation mentioned above. This process signifies a revelation as inappropriateness. In Heidegger's phenomenology, inappropriateness is also simply called negation. It refers to the phenomena of loss, damage, collapse, and deprivation or detachment mentioned above. Fundamentally, these are relationships between humans and the surrounding world. In Heidegger's phenomenology, however, the thesis of this essay was that these arguments can also be applied to Shakespeare's King Lear. Heidegger presented a decisive observation as mentioned above. An object is only truly revealed when we fail to use it. He distinguished three forms of impairment, namely, damage is when a tool breaks, malfunction is when it does not work properly, and absence is when we seek it but cannot find it. At such moments, the object undergoes a phenomenological transformation. Heidegger called this progress of mind transformation. There is also the term derivation. This means that various forms of meaning are derived from a single fact. From a Husserlian perspective, this can be described as follows. First, there is the selection of an object. There is a rose over, there then a judgment arises that that statement is true. And subsequently, value judgments such as the rose smells fragrant, or I like it may emerge. However, since Heidegger's phenomenology is not idealistic, but existential, that is, a phenomenology that begins with the human being as a single entity, he traces meaning in a manner diametrically opposed to Husserl's. In this process, a phenomenology of Dasein emerges, rather than a phenomenology of consciousness, and from this concept, he walks the path of existential inquiry into concealment, unconcealment, or unveiling. For Heidegger, the term phenomenon means truth. The truth is the truth of Dasein. In phenomenological terms, a phenomenon as truth is initially concealed. The path of phenomenology lies in escaping this concealment and disguise. Heidegger describes it as follows.
Covered-upness is the counter-concept to phenomenon. There are various ways in which phenomena can be covered up. In the first place, a phenomenon can be covered up in the sense that it is still quite undiscovered. It is neither known nor unknown. Moreover, a phenomenon can be buried over for should it. This means that it has at some time been discovered, but has deteriorated for feel to the point of getting covered up again. BTP 60.
The concealment mentioned above is also referred to as being hidden. A phenomenon may be concealed in the sense that it is in a state of never having been discovered. In this case, it is said to be a state in which one neither knows nor does not know whether the phenomenon exists. Furthermore, it is said that a phenomenon may be buried. Being buried refers, for example, to scientific or everyday entities that are right before our eyes. Because these are usually so self-evident, we fail to see their essence, that is, their existence in our grasp. This principle can be applied to the play King Lear, For example, it was well structured in the bizarre events involving Gloucester, the father who had his eyes gouged out and could no longer see, and his son Edgar, who had to pretend to be naked and mad. Edgar is branded a traitor due to the conspiracy of his half-brother Edmund, and is forced to flee. And to survive, he disguises himself as poor Tom, a vagrant, madman, and beggar. He smears mud on his body, wanders around, nearly naked, and speaks in a deranged manner. This disguise is a strategy for him to evade pursuit and survive. In the case of tools, what was previously usable becomes unusable, and may even appear to simply exist, that is, to appear as a mere object that can be observed theoretically. In other words, the structure of the world becomes visible for the first time. Through functional failure and damage, we come to realize how much we depend on familiar processes, and how our daily lives are sustained by a well-functioning network. Heidegger called this withdrawal from the world, or Entweltlichung. Only when things are removed from their semantic context and the world is torn apart at a single point can it be recognized as the world. Here, the recognition of things is conveyed through loss, the loss of functionality, the loss of toolness, and the loss of taken-for-grantedness. The world reveals itself through absence. This analysis can be generalized. We recognize the world only when the structure of our relationship with it breaks down. In Heidegger's terms, it is only when concealment disappears that it opens up brightly. That is, when familiar meanings collapse, the ontological layer of our existence is revealed. In this way, loss becomes a phenomenological key. Through loss, unconcealment that is, the revelatory nature of truth is revealed. Abbas, the collapse of the world as the pioneering of being. Heidegger refers to situations where the everyday world slips away, or collapses as particularly epistemic. This may be an existential crisis such as grief, fear, or loneliness, but it may also be a moment of sudden change or meaninglessness. In such situations, the world does not merely change, it loses its structure. And it is precisely because of this that phenomena are revealed. Amid terror, fear, and a state of utter uncertainty, the abyss of being usually concealed is revealed. Fear renders the world itself unsettled. That is, it shows that familiar meanings are not self-evident. Here, being faces itself unprotected and without an interpretive framework. Fear is not harmful. It is ontologically beneficial. It is a shift toward a true perspective on the world. The loss of the familiar world opens up a view of its ontological foundation. The hammer reveals itself in the act of breaking. The world reveals itself in the act of slipping. The self reveals itself in the act of losing. Conscience appeals through deprivation. Heidegger describes the so-called call of conscience as follows.
The call dispenses with any kind of utterance. It does not put itself into words at all, yet it remains nothing less than obscure and indefinite. Conscience discourses solely and constantly in the mode of keeping silent. BTP 318.
Here, Heidegger emphasizes that conscience does not speak. In the form of linguistic commands or moral rules, conscience does not appear as clear. Statements such as, do this, do not do that. Instead, it functions as a wordless, call and appeal in silence, urging one to return to oneself. Therefore, the voice of conscience is understood not as audible speech, but as a call of existential awareness experienced in the moment. When everyday certainties crumble, the truth of being is revealed in existence toward death. Recognition is a movement of emptying, separation, and stripping away. It is a movement that returns being to the bare structure of its being. Human beings who live as worldly people return to themselves. Only when they abandon their worldly lives, that is, when they are stripped of their worldliness. For Heidegger, true cognition is always cognition through loss. It is like the kernel being revealed when the shell is peeled away. It is unconcealment. Only when a person temporarily withdraws from the world and from themselves do they truly become themselves. And it is precisely within this loss that they gain a deeper and more primordial mode of understanding.